My name is Rosemary Butler and I have the very great privilege of being the presiding officer at the National Assembly for Wales. And I'm delighted to see so many of you here this evening for this very prestigious event. And as presiding officer, I am absolutely delighted that Helen Clark, Administrator to the United Nations Development Programme and former Prime Minister of New Zealand, has kindly agreed to address us this evening. We were slightly delayed coming in because Helen is a tweeter, and so she had to tweet before we came in. So I hope none of you are going to be tweeting while Helen's speaking. But during my term as presiding officer, one of the themes I am concentrating on is equality. And this year, my focus is particularly on women. So it's very appropriate that we have here Helen, who is the first woman to lead the United Nations Development Programme. And I'm personally looking forward to hearing what she has to say and her thoughts on inclusion and equality and why women's leadership matters. So I'm really delighted that we have Kate Bennett, who has kindly agreed to chair this evening's proceedings. I'm sure you all know Kate, but for those of you who don't, you're missing something. But Kate is the Director for Equality and Human Rights Commission in Wales, and I'm delighted that she's accepted my invitation this evening. So, not surprisingly, tickets for this evening's event were taken up very quickly, and I know that we have a capacity audience here this evening. So I hope you enjoy it, and you're all very welcome, and I'd now like to welcome Kate Bennett to the floor.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much indeed, Rosemary. I just want to make a rather fuller introduction of Helen, having had the privilege to meet her over the last few minutes. I know that we're in for a big treat tonight. Helen became the administrator of the United Nations Development Programme in April 2009 and is the first woman to lead the organisation. She's also chair of the United Nations Development Group, a committee consisting of the heads of all UN funds, programmes and departments working on development issues. Prior to this appointment, Helen served for 9 years as the Prime Minister of New Zealand, serving 3 successive terms from 1999 to 2008. Throughout her tenure as Prime Minister, Helen engaged widely in policy development and advocacy across international, economic, social and cultural spheres. Under her leadership, New Zealand achieved significant economic growth, low levels of unemployment, and high levels of investment in education and health, and in the well-being of families and older citizens. She and her government prioritised reconciliation and the settlement of historical grievances with New Zealand's Indigenous people and the development of an inclusive, multicultural and multi-faith society. Helen advocated strongly for New Zealand's comprehensive programme on sustainability and for tackling the problems of climate change. Her objectives have been to establish New Zealand as being amongst the world's leading nations in relation to these challenges. She's also an active leader of her current country's foreign relations and policies, engaging in a wide range of international issues. As Prime Minister, Helen was member of the Council of Women World Leaders, an international network of current and former women presidents and prime ministers, whose mission is to mobilise the highest level women leaders globally for collective action on issues of critical importance to women and equitable development. It just sounds fantastic. I just completely bowled over. But to continue, Helen Clark held ministerial responsibility during her 9 years as Prime Minister for New Zealand's intelligence agencies and the portfolio of arts, culture and heritage. She's seen the promotion of this latter portfolio as important in expressing the unique identity of her nation in a positive way. Helen came to the role of Prime Minister after an extensive parliamentary and ministerial career. First elected to Parliament in 1981, Helen was re-elected to her multicultural Auckland constituency for the 10th time in November 2008. And earlier in her career, she'd chaired Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. I mean, that just sounds like the most fantastic series of achievements. And I think we are incredibly lucky to have Helen here tonight. I think if you want something done, give it to a busy woman, feels like the motto. Before I pass over to Helen, I would just like to pay tribute to Rosemary as our first ever female presiding officer for persuading Helen to come here. And to note that Wales was, of course, the first country in the world to achieve perfect gender balance back in 2003, when 30 women and 30 men were elected to the National Assembly for Wales. We've slipped a little since then, as our Who Runs Wales publication shows, but this issue remains high on the government agenda, and there is a commitment to explore the issues of quotas to ensure proper representation at our top tables. Also in Wales, we have twin duties to promote equality and sustainability, and we have a keen interest in development around the world. The Wales for Africa scheme, helping communities in Wales link with African communities. So it's my great pleasure with this big audience and such a fantastic speech in store to welcome you to the platform, Helen.
Thank you very much, Kate, for the introduction. Rosemary Butler, Presiding Officer of the National Assembly of Wales, ministers and Assembly members who are present, and ladies and gentlemen. Can I start by saying I don't need any persuasion to come to Wales. I had a great-grandmother whose name was Mary Ann Evans, a rather typical surname, I think, for Wales. And I first came here in 1976 when I was in the United Kingdom on a scholarship from New Zealand, and I came back twice as New Zealand Prime Minister. The second occasion I prefer not to remember, because I was seated in your great stadium for the quarter-final of the Rugby World Cup. And I was seated next to President Sarkozy of France for a game which he assured me at the outset would be a walkover by the All Blacks. Well, it was a wipeout by the French, but I thought I might get some sympathy for that with the Welsh audience, given what happened in the semi-final in Auckland, the Rugby World Cup, late last year. But I was also very happy to come back to Cardiff last March when Wales hosted the Commonwealth Local Government Conference, which Auckland, my home city in New Zealand, had hosted a couple of times before. And I was able to talk there about some of the work that the UN Development Programme does at the sub-national governance level. But to come back and talk about sex matters, women and their impacts on politics and society, as this Piedmont Peerhead session is titled, is obviously of great interest to me, professionally and personally. And of course, central to UNDP's mandate is promoting gender equality and empowerment, and that runs as a theme right across our work. But for myself, on a personal level, I count myself very fortunate to have been a member of the post-war baby boomer generation in New Zealand, where as a girl, every opportunity was open to me. And as a woman, I was able to pursue the career of my choice and meet my professional aspirations. And I could wish for nothing more for every girl and woman in our world. However, I do know a little about breaking into male-dominated fields, of which politics has been one of the main ones. As Prime Minister of New Zealand for 9 years, Leader of the Opposition for 6 years before that, with a lot of people doubting that a woman could ever become Prime Minister, Leader of the New Zealand Labour Party for 15 years, and a Member of Parliament for 27 and a half years, I did climb a greasy pole in a field which was not always that easy to break into. So tonight, the title we've given the talk is Inclusion and Equality, Why Women's Leadership Matters. And I will talk about why it matters that women like Rosemary become the first presiding officer of the National Assembly of Wales, why it matters that women become ministers and legislators and are prominent in public administration and go all the way to be political party leaders and leaders of their countries. So the starting point, I guess, is that it is, of course, a basic human right for women to enjoy full legal equality and equality of opportunity. and for a girl born today in any country to have the same life chances as any boy. And I'll comment a little bit later on why this is so critical in getting a breakthrough in development. Because if you leave half your population out of the progress of a country, how can you ever expect to lift your whole country to its full potential? And I believe that having a critical mass of women in leadership and in decision-making positions is very positive for human development in every country, whether that country is developed, like mine or yours, or developing, whether a country is living in peace, whether it's recovering from conflict, or in the process of a democratic transition. I want to talk a little bit about countries in those latter categories as well. But let me note at the outset that Wales really is to be commended for the prominent role which women have assumed in leadership here at the National Assembly level. And it is particularly commendable that since Welsh devolution, the proportion of Assembly members who are women has never dropped below 40%. And indeed, I think once reached a high of 51%, which was even better. And part of the key to that will be the family-friendly policies which have been adopted by the Assembly in the way it schedules its committee meetings and its plenary sessions. That does make it easier for women to be able to take part. The New Zealand Parliament eventually established an early childhood centre alongside the Parliament, which made it obviously very, very useful for Wellington-based members of Parliament who had small children, and particularly for the staff. There's so many things that one can do to make workplaces family-friendly. So, come back to what I said about gender equality being a basic human right. It's actually enshrined as such in the very first article of the UN Charter, which states that one of the purposes of the UN is promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. That was 1945, a strong and visionary statement. But a lot of other UN instruments, conventions, decisions reinforce that commitment. For example, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, known in the trade as CEDAW, from 1979, which stresses the equality of women and men across human rights and fundamental freedoms in the political, economic, social, cultural, civil, or any other field. And specifically on political and public life, the CEDAW Convention notes that the member states who sign up to the convention, which is almost all, should take measures to see that women on equal terms with men have the right to hold public office and perform all public functions at all levels of government. So remember, when advocating for these things, they're absolutely enshrined in the international human rights instruments. There have been, since 1975, 4 UN World Conferences on women. And the 4th one in Beijing, again, that was the last one that was held, also affirmed gender equality as a human right and committed governments to enhancing women's rights. Fast forward then to the Millennium Declaration of the UN in 2000, and I was able to go to the Millennium Summit of the UN that year and sign the declaration. Again, it is promoting equal rights and opportunities for women and men, and the Millennium Development Goals, which were promulgated after that summit, have a specific goal, MDG 3, on gender equality. Most recent very significant move on gender equality in the UN was the UN created a new organisation which pulled together what you might call women's dots or focal points around the UN system into one comprehensive organisation called UN Women. Its longer title is the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, but it is a specific agency to promote and advocate for women. And as I said, in my own organisation, typical of the UN organisations generally, we are mandated to pursue gender equality over everything we do. And we work in the areas of crisis prevention and recovery, we work on governance, we work on poverty reduction, we work on environment, energy, climate issues, we work on combating the spread of HIV and other deadly diseases. And as I said, if we go beyond the human right as such to gender equality, there's also the very important aspect that any investment that a society makes in women and girls will have huge multiplier effects for that society. We see in development that where for every extra year of education a girl can get, she will be likely to be able to delay the age of marriage and the age of having her first baby. That is better for her health, it is better for the prospects of her child. Obviously, with advancing level of education, her economic prospects are better, and the studies are starting to link all of that to better prospects for the children as well. So we can see very, very real material and quality of life benefits from the investments that go into something as basic as education. Then on the basic principle of equality, of course, fair representation and participation of women is one of the preconditions for achieving a genuine democracy. There cannot be real democracy if half the population is excluded from participation and from power. And I don't think anyone would think that Athenian-style democracy, where only some men had voice, will do in the 21st century. So having sort of laid out those basic principles, let's look at where we are today. The first woman who was not a monarch to become a national leader was the Prime Minister of Sri Lanka, Mrs. Bandaranaike, in 1960. A total of 3 women were national leaders in the 1960s in our world, 6 in the 1970s, and 7 in the 1980s. This is truly pathetic, isn't it? Single figures. And the total numbers of women who've reached these positions have risen only slowly since. New Zealand has supplied 2, United Kingdom 1. Today in our world there are only 8 women heads of state, representing slightly more than 5% of the total. You may have noticed that a woman has stepped up to become president after the death of the president in Malawi. She brought the numbers back up to 8 because the woman president of Finland has just stepped down and been replaced by a man. So, it really is just sitting absolutely at 8. And heads of state, of course, include queens. So if we count the Queen of the United Kingdom, New Zealand and others, the Queen of Denmark, the Queen of the Netherlands, that means 5 elected heads of state are women. Now, if we take all heads of state and heads of government together who are women, that's a total of 18. This is still a very small proportion. Wouldn't take us much over the 5% total for just heads of state. So quite extraordinary in the second decade of the 21st century. At the Millennium Summit in New York of the United Nations, Mary Robinson, who'd gone from being President of Ireland to being the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, decided to convene a meeting of women heads of UN agencies and heads of government. I think there were a total of about 8 of us in the room, and I formed a binding friendship with the current Prime Minister of Bangladesh. The President of Latvia was there, Gro Harlem Brundtland. I mean, I can almost remember every name of the participant. It was such a very, very small number. And then if we look at numbers of women holding parliamentary seats, well, globally, the proportion of women in parliaments, national parliaments, remains at under 20%, which is well below the 30% target which was set in Beijing at the World Conference on Women and in the Millennium Development Goal. And if you took the current rate of progress to get to 30%, well, we would not get there before 2025 as a global average, and long beyond that for many, many countries. So that seems to me to be rather a long time for women to wait. Now, at the national legislative level, there are only around 41 women speakers or heads of parliament. Only 16% of ministers are women. And it won't surprise you to hear me say that most often they are allocated the portfolios for women and youth and children and social welfare and nothing else. And often they are the one woman as well. I've just visited a country recently where there was one woman minister with exactly those responsibilities. It's not atypical. If we look at proportion of women in national parliaments in the world's regions, they range from roughly 22% in the Americas and Europe. The 42% in the Nordic countries tends to boost the figures a little, through to 20.2% in sub-Saharan Africa, just under 18% in Asia, 15% in the Pacific, and 10.7% in the Arab states. And we still have 5 countries, all in the Gulf and the Pacific, which have no women parliamentarians at all. Now, why is this a problem? Well, in my experience, when women are out of sight, out of mind, getting their needs met becomes quite a tall order. On the other hand, when you get a critical mass of women decision makers, issues which previously were not considered particularly important start to get their way up the agenda. And I just want to pluck out, some examples of where women's representation has gone over the threshold of the 30%, where some quite interesting things start to happen. So take Rwanda, which is the country with the highest proportion of women parliamentarians anywhere in the world at 56%. And in 2006, their parliament passed a far-reaching law to combat gender-based violence, passed with cross-party support brokered by the Forum of Rwandan Women Parliamentarians. They reached out to the men as well. They got this issue on the agenda and got legislation passed. Costa Rica, 2002, numbers of women in parliament by then exceeded 30%. They got a law passed on the protection of adolescent mothers to give adolescent mothers free health services and education. Tanzania, 2004, 4 years after their constitution was amended to state that women had to hold no less than 20% of the parliamentary seats, they were able to get through an amendment to the Land Act, which granted equal rights and access to land, loans and credit for women. This is incredibly important because still in quite a lot of the countries in which we work, women have no right to own land, they have no right to inherit land, they cannot access credit. There's a lot of very practical barriers that stand in the way of women getting ahead. So to see the Parliament of Tanzania take that on is very exciting. In Spain, with women MPs also over the 30% mark, a law 5 years ago mandated affirmative action measures for employment and working conditions. Nepal, 2007, their share of women in the Inter-Legislative Assembly was at close to 20%. They got their finance ministry to adopt gender-responsive budgeting for all government expenditure. And for the 2008 elections, quotas were established to ensure that a third of the members elected to the Constituent Assembly were women. So these are all quite practical and helpful examples of what issues can come to the fore when women start to get critical mass. And there's some quite interesting evidence now of what happens at the local level when women begin to become prominently represented. In India, for example, at the most basic level of local council, there has for close to 20 years been a law which says at least 30% of the members must be women. And of course the women have done rather better than that now in quite a lot of councils, and the research on that shows that the women-led councils approved 60% more drinking water projects than did those led by men. You know, when you look at the sort of decisions that are coming out of these councils, they're often dealing with very, very important basic things for health and services for the community. And with something like water, this matters so much to women and girls who are usually the ones in the family who have to walk the long distances to get the water from a distant source. So one really hopes that as many more women take their rightful place in the ranks of decision makers at every level, we will see more of these kinds of issues coming up to the top of the priority list to be addressed. And one can think of issues which are certainly crying out for more attention. Take, for example, Millennium Development Goal 5, which called for a reduction in the rate of maternal mortality by 75% from the 1990 rate to 2015. This has been the hardest Millennium Development Goal to meet by far. Why? Because again, it speaks to the status of women in a society, the level of services, the access to services, and so on. The world is nowhere near meeting that 75% reduction, and I would feel absolutely confident that if more women were among the decision makers, these issues would be prioritised. Take tackling the HIV epidemic. The reality is that women's inequality and lack of power in relationships is putting them at greater risk of exposure to HIV and is increasing their burdens of care. And the figures I have for Southern Africa suggest that girls are 2 to 4.5 times more likely than boys to become infected with HIV. There's a huge gap there. And again, as I say, it points to lack of equality, lack of power. It also relates into gender-based violence as a transmission vehicle for HIV as well. So what we want is more women in decision-making positions who will be prepared to look at policies through a gender lens. And I look back on my time as PM in New Zealand and some of the wonderful things we were able to do because there was a critical mass of women to support that, like enshrining in law the right to paid parental leave, and increasing the statutory minimum entitlement on annual holidays to give the extra week, 20 hours free early childhood care and education as a right for parents, and interest-free loans for tertiary students. All these kinds of policies were a particular benefit to women, and quite a lot others as well. Now, I wanted to talk a little about the position of women in what we call crisis countries, or countries that are trying to recover from crisis, where women's participation and leadership in building peace and putting down the foundations for development is very, very important. And more than 1/5 of the world's population is estimated to be living in states which would be considered fragile in some way, and not a single state in that category is on course to achieve all the Millennium Development Goals, and a number are not on course to achieve a single one of them. When a country goes into a profound crisis of war, conflict, armed violence, the specific social obligations and responsibilities placed on women impose a greater burden on them. They're often trying to keep a family together in the most impossible circumstances. And added to that is what to me is the horror story of sexual and gender-based violence and exploitation, which is afflicting women in so many nations during and after conflict. Sadly, we're seeing the reports come through now from the north of Mali on this gender-based violence, rape, sexual assault featuring in the conflict that has been going on there. The very first country I visited as UNDP administrator was Liberia, which went through around 20 years of profound conflict. And I remember sitting at a round table of women in the capital, Monrovia, and everybody introduced themselves and said who they were and what they represented. And we came round the table to the lady who said, I represent women living with HIV/AIDS. She said, I was raped during the Civil War, and that's how I contracted HIV. Sadly, this is not an uncommon story, but for me it was, reality check right on my very first visit. So in the UN, this impact of armed violence and conflict and all its consequences has been getting a lot more attention with respect to women since 2000. And in that year, the UN Security Council passed a landmark resolution, 1325, on women, peace and security, which calls for special measures to protect women and girls from gender-based violence and for consideration to be given to their special needs during repatriation, resettlement and post-conflict reconstruction. It called for women to be empowered in the peace-building process, their voices to be heard, and for them to be included as active participants in preventing conflict, managing the way out of it, and actually resolving it. And there's been more resolutions since which have recognised this key role of women in peace-building and recovery as a matter of women's and girls' rights, and as important in setting down lasting foundations for peace. Now, we see lots of good examples of the role women play in these sorts of troubled contexts. For example, Guatemala, Burundi, Bosnia. The women's peace organisations and coalitions played significant roles in helping to bring about peace. In Rwanda, following the genocide, the women emerged as central arbiters of peace and reconciliation. In Liberia, the women were pushing for the disarmament of the fighting factions even before the signing of the peace accord. Why would it surprise us? The women are out there wanting peace and stability for their country and for their families. And as one of the things UNDP does, we do support women's groups in such countries to contribute to being part of the peace process, the conflict resolution process. In East Timor, we did specifically that around the informal peace processes and mediation. In Fiji, not so long ago, we supported women to play a role in the first broadly based dialogue there has been between civil society and state officials since the current military-led government took power. But we're still finding that women are underrepresented at the peace tables, the donor conferences, and in decision-making and planning and budgeting in the post-crisis settings, and that financing for gender equality is really a priority in these settings. So there's much work to do there. What we know is that women will bring the everyday concerns of communities to peace discussions. They will want to know, where are the jobs, where are the livelihoods, what about access to justice, what about rule of law, how do we get the gender-based crimes dealt with? There's a lot of very practical issues women put on the table. Of course, one of the most inspiring examples of women's leadership in a country which has gone through profound trauma is to be found in Liberia, in President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who is to this day the first ever elected female African head of state. In her inaugural address 6 years ago, she recognised the key role that Liberian women had played in bringing about peace and pledged to give Liberian women prominence in, quote, all the affairs of our country. She proceeded to nominate women as 2 of the 5 members of the Supreme Court and to appoint many women to her cabinet, including her First Minister of Finance and her Ministers of Agriculture, Commerce, Foreign Affairs, Gender and Development, Justice and Youth and Sports. She did really well. And in her first term, she ensured that a specialised rape court was set up to speed up the processing of the rape cases. And that was vital because the high rates of sexual violence which women had experienced during the conflict meant there were a lot of cases to investigate and to prosecute. And she also saw through changes to the general law on gender-based violence, including domestic violence and rape, and increased the penalties for them to demonstrate how gravely they should be treated. Just a word on the role of women in public administration. While public administrations or civil or public services are often among the most important employers of women, you could observe that in a lot of countries they perpetuate rather than challenge gender bias. We see the largest numbers of women still being found at the lower level of these structures where they have the least influence. There haven't been mechanisms for tracking this at a global level, but our own organisation is just undertaking the first global stock-taking of women in public administration, particularly in leadership positions, and looking at strategies which could actually boost women. But as anyone who's been in government knows, you rely a lot on your public officials for advice that you get on policies. So if your assembled public officialdom's leaders are all men, the sort of perspectives on issues of the kind I'm talking about are not as likely to come through. So let's not overlook the critical importance of representation in public administrations as well. Now, I promised to say a little about the place of women in democratic transitions, and I will, with specific reference to the Arab states, where the uprisings of the last 16 months or so have obviously dominated the international news bulletins. And as you watch those bulletins, you'll see in many countries how actively the women have been involved in those events as protest leaders and participants, and in spreading the word through conventional and new social media. Indeed, last year's Nobel Prize winners included not only President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and another Liberian prize winner, but also a young woman from Yemen called Tawakkol Karman. I met Tawakkol when I went to Yemen in January last year, and she is an extremely passionate advocate for a more democratic Yemen, and it's really wonderful to see what she was contributing, being recognised at the level of a Nobel Prize. So, women have gone into these uprisings and movements for change in the Arab states, hoping that, out the other end will be more for them as well. And indeed, the state of equality, if we're to measure it by positions in government, the economy, etc., in the Arab states, it's not so good for women. There was a joint publication from the UN and the Arab League a couple of years ago which showed that women were only 10% of all the parliamentarians in the region, the lowest rate in the world, that the unemployment rate for Arab women last year was double that for Arab men, that the economic participation of Arab women remains the lowest of women anywhere in the world, at 26.3%, and concentrated in the informal sector where you don't have the protections of employment law and associated protections. And in some countries, the illiteracy levels remain high for women, along with high maternal mortality rates. So obviously a democratic transition you would look to as an opportunity to try to address gender inequities. But we're not seeing at this point women able to make the breakthroughs in the region which might have been hoped for. Tunisia, work was certainly done to promote women's participation in the elections. We were part of that with Tunisian counterparts, and to have electoral processes which enabled fair competition. And there was an electoral law adopted which required the alternation of men and women on political party lists for the election. But this did not see any rise in the proportion of women in the new Constituent Assembly over the number that was there before, which was 24% and higher than the global average, but not making a breakthrough to the 30% international target level. At the time of the Tunisian election, women held under 10% of the decision-making positions in the political parties, and only one party was led by a woman. Now only 3 of the 44 cabinet posts are held by women. So we're not seeing a breakthrough as a result of that transition. Move to Egypt, where those recent elections resulted in only 9 women being elected. 2 were appointed to this 508-seat assembly. Take it all together, that's just under 2% of the membership. It's very, very low. What we see in the region now is women's and other civil society organisations advocating for women's rights to be anchored in the new constitutions and the laws to be written. But of course, for that to happen, the advocates for this and the experts need to have meaningful input into the drafting processes and the decision-making processes. And from the point of view of UNDP and UN Women, we're working as hard as we can to support this advocacy. But in the end, these societies have to determine that this is what they want to prioritise, and it is a long road. So let's come to some of the things which one could do to change these circumstances. There is absolutely no doubt that the quickest way to lift women's representation in elected bodies is through the use of quotas. Having said that, let me say it is controversial everywhere. I remember in New Zealand people used to say, why isn't there a quota? And you'd say, well, we're making progress. We got to the 30% level with the introduction of proportional representation. And it's pretty much stayed at 30% or above since then. Since coming to UNDP, I've seen a couple of countries where we work absolutely paralysed on this issue of the quota. We supported the one woman Member of Parliament and Minister in Papua New Guinea at her request to draw up legislation for a quota for women's membership, 22 women members. This bill has been paralysed in that Parliament for the last 2 years. It's just not going anywhere. I was in India on International Women's Day 2 years ago when the upper house, amidst absolute uproar, and only after the direct intervention of Sonia Gandhi, passed the bill for 30% women's representation in the Indian Parliament. The bill has now moved to the lower house and it has made no progress in 2 years. This is deeply, deeply controversial. But where you can get the quotas, and I'll come back to that in a moment, it certainly will rapidly increase women's membership. And indeed, if I think back to pre-1997 and the British Labour Party's adoption of the women-only shortlist, that absolutely made a breakthrough here, which would not have been impossible without it. Another way forward, of course, is to adopt proportional representation systems which do put pressure on political parties to choose women candidates for winnable positions. Well, someone might say, why is that? The truth is, women are making up half the voters. They look at a party list. If the party list is numbered male, 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 why would women vote for this? So parties do feel under pressure to put women more prominently on their lists. So these systems do make a difference. There's no doubt in my mind that the hardest electoral systems for women to penetrate are those which are based on the single member constituency. And there, the stereotypical image of an MP has been that of a man, and often a man with a wife who helps in the constituency and runs the home. Those stereotypes, of course, are breaking down, but the process has not been very fast. A proportional system of some sort, whether it's national lists, regional lists, single transferable vote, those kinds of systems are definitely more conducive to the entry of women. Now, of the 59 countries which had elections last year for lower or single houses of parliament, 17 had legislated for electoral quotas for women, 9 had used quotas within political parties, and 33 did neither of the above. In the ones which had legislated for quotas, women won 27.4% of the places, and in the ones without any form of quota or special measure, women were only 15.7%. So you can see the figures really do point to quotas or special measures like the ones the parties take themselves, making a significant difference. We're seeing this too in these countries which are making the transition out of crisis that I was speaking about before. There was a review last year by the Interparliamentary Union which looked at 23 countries with a history of conflict, and it revealed that where the rejuvenation of their political systems included putting in place gender quotas for election, women held 1/3 of the parliamentary seats in the elections that followed. Of the 11 others emerging from conflict which hadn't implemented quotas, women held only 16% of the seats. So, twice as many for the ones who'd put in place the quotas. I mentioned Rwanda earlier as really quite a compelling example of a society where the empowerment of women as decision-making makers is playing a significant role. They put the 30% quota for their MPs into the 2003 constitution. That led to them having the 56% of the seats today, which is the highest proportion in the world, and 32% of ministerial positions are held by women in Rwanda. They led efforts after the 1994 genocide to amend discriminatory statutes like the old laws on nationality and citizenship. I could say a lot more about Rwanda, but it's a very, very interesting example of women's power in action. Next door to Rwanda is Burundi, where quotas were also introduced, a 30% quota for the national elections. That was exceeded in 2010. Women took 34% of the parliamentary seats there, and Burundi has the highest proportion of women in the upper house in Africa at 46%. Very, very interesting how countries which have had as troubled a past as Rwanda and Burundi have really taken the issue of women's representation to heart. Beyond quotas, of course, it also helps if women have fair access to sources of finance for election, and electoral commissions need to be vigilant in their oversight of electoral finance laws to reduce bribery and corruption before and during campaigns by others. We also see campaign violence as a significant disincentive to women's full political participation, and security for women candidates and voters is needed to encourage full participation and engagement in societies where political violence features. But now I come to the point of political parties, because political parties can be the greatest champions of women's representation or the greatest opponents, either passively or actively. What we see around the world is that women tend to be highly represented at the grassroots levels. And when I came into politics, often the role of women was in the sort of women's auxiliary. If there was a plate of scones and a cup of tea to be made afterwards, that was the women's role, not on the decision-making roles. That was one of the things we had to change. We find women comprising 40 to 50% of the membership of political parties around the world, but only around 10% of the leadership positions. Yet, if women don't get to lead political parties, how will they ever get to be a prime minister in many, many countries where the prime minister comes from the largest party? You have to get women up to these levels to get more women into leadership. So, acknowledging the critical role of political parties, UNDP has produced a new guidebook together with the National Democratic Institute of the United States, and it's called Empowering Women for Stronger Political Parties, and it takes a whole electoral cycle approach, and it looks at best practice, who has done what well, which other parties might like to emulate. It looks at the pre-election period when you're selecting candidates and what measures will help get women more prominently into electable positions. It looks at the campaign period and the need to ensure that women candidates aren't just left to languish with no funding or support, how you can change that. And then it looks at the post-election period and the importance of ongoing peer support and help for women candidates who've been elected, particularly if they're coming into roles which are uncommon for women in that particular society. So we're distributing this booklet widely around the world, and I think you can anticipate it will be followed by a lot of workshops and so on, and many, many capitals working with political parties to spread these kinds of ideas. But as I say, if women aren't able to get into these positions in legislatures at the national level, the subnational level, the local level, if they're not more prominent in leadership, not more prominent in women's in public administration, then you're just not going to get a lot of the basic issues which would make such a huge difference to the life of women and their families and their communities addressed. And I think this point is as valid for developed countries as it is for developing countries. So let me conclude my remarks by saying that a very big focus for me as a leader is to be part of building a more equitable and sustainable world, and accepting the opportunity to come and talk in this lecture series as an opportunity to talk about the importance of these issues. You know, our world faces some pretty complex problems and challenges. Women should be part of finding the solutions. I think that the benefits of having women at leadership levels and represented in legislatures across the board are well established. I think here in Wales you have a lot to be proud of with what's happened since devolution, with the representation of women at this subnational level of government. I hear there may be still some way to go at the local government level, which is interesting to me because in New Zealand women tended to come through in local government long before the breakthrough was made at the parliamentary level. But perhaps we should also spread the UNDP guidebook on women and political parties here in Wales as well, to give some new ideas for that too. But truly we can draw on so much best practice and experience around the world of what does work in really getting women better represented at all levels. And I'm not pessimistic at all about the prospects. I think there's something inevitable here if we keep advocating and keep talking about the importance of these issues and following through with the practical steps which really will make a difference. Thank you.
Well, that was fantastic. I thought it was a fantastic roundup of quite a lot of the arguments that we know, but an injection of a massive number of facts and statistics and measures and ideas that we don't know about. And I certainly think looking at that guidebook will be useful for us. We have up to about 30 minutes, which is fantastic, for questions. So I don't know who'd like to kick us off. Do you want to just say who you are? Oh, sorry, there's a mic coming.
Sorry, my name is Dr. Clive Morgan. You hinted at positive discrimination and the sort of the controversiality of that. Can you say a little bit more about that, perhaps relating it specifically to England and Wales? I understand one of the political parties in the UK did engage at one stage in some degree of sort of preferential treatment for one sex. Thank you.
Yes, the 1997 election, British Labour did make quite a big lift in its representation of women in the Commons, no question, and that came from that all-women shortlist system, which was introduced. Now, that later took a bit of a beating, and I think it was dropped as a mechanism. And I'd be interested to have a look at what happened to women's representation for that party since that time. But I remember in New Zealand, quotas was an issue that you would just wait to be beaten over the head with by vocal voices. But I have no doubt that if nothing else is working, if your representation is stuck at low levels, as it is in many, many countries, quotas just have to be looked at. Or you legislate for special measures by parties, or parties have to take special measures. But of course, we're talking a redistribution of power here. In the case of the bill before the Indian Parliament, I think the way it's been drafted, some seats would be designated as seats where only women would be able to compete for the seat. Well, of course, the blokes who currently hold these seats don't much like that. And then I think the idea was in the next election it might move to a different set of seats, but the plan was to sort of break the culture of there only ever in effect being a choice between male candidates. The Papua New Guinea legislation, which has been so controversial, didn't deprive any male of a seat. It said there would be 22 constituencies, one for each of the provinces of Papua New Guinea, as I recall. And at that level, there would be a woman-only contest for those specific seats. So they were adding 22 seats. Even this has run into terrible, terrible trouble. It must come down to a resentment at distribution of power to include more women. It's something as fundamental as that one is up against when one advocates these things. But as I said, the figures point to the fact that those with quotas get far more women elected. And you can make that change quite rapidly from one election to the next.
Oh, it's behind you.
It's here, okay. Jennifer Twelvetrees, and I'm part of Women for Resources, which is a partnership between women in Wales and women in sub-Saharan Africa. I've just returned from Liberia, where volunteers in Wales have been working alongside our sisters for the past 6 years. And the women in this small community of Rock Hill have just opened their first women's centre. Now, the irony is not lost on them that we in the United Kingdom are now fighting to keep our women's services going. And I wonder if you had any thoughts on how we can sustain the services that we've got for women in Britain. Because, as I say, it is odd to be working in Liberia where they're opening up their first refuges, they're opening up their women's centres, and 40 years ago, some of us in this room were involved in doing that in the United Kingdom. But we actually are under threat because of the economic situation. So your thoughts would be very interesting on this.
Well, I think in these circumstances, one needs to build coalitions of support, and I think the advocacy voices of women's organisations are extremely important. Trying perhaps to bring women together across the political parties to advocate for a more gender responsive approach to public spending. I mean, I remember being in Ukraine at the end of 2010, and there'd just been announcements made about major sort of public service restructuring, and one of the first things that went was the women's ministry, and the women were absolutely distraught because they'd really worked hard for this ministry, and then almost at the stroke of a pen it had gone, and it's a long way back from that. So in the end, representative government needs to hear from from civil society, from coalitions of support which can advocate for these things. And I think, throwing in some international comparisons like, why are we exiting this when others are in the process of doing it, put the debate into quite useful perspective.
Hello, thank you so much for coming. I'd like you to comment, my name is Richie Turner, by the way. I'd like you to comment potentially both on the role of women's leaders in democracy that you've just talked about, but also your role at the UNDP. What can or should you believe the UN be doing now to ensure that what happened to my hero Aung San Suu Kyi back in 1988, when surely she should and would have become one of those leaders on your list for the 1980s. What could the UN be doing to ensure that that doesn't happen again in 2012?
Well, Aung San Suu Kyi fought an election and won and was never able to assume the position of Prime Minister in her country, and for that reason her cause and the cause of democracy in Burma has been a very powerful one for the last however many years, a lot of years. And as New Zealand Prime Minister, I was one of the most vocal leaders about this. I remember signing a statement on one occasion with other women leaders calling for her freedom, but it was an issue that was often taken up by me, including on the East Asian circuit and at the East Asian Summit. So, it seems that events are on the move in Burma, and that Aung San Suu Kyi herself felt sufficient confidence to come forward and run in elections and has been elected. I think there is a path to change there, but it's going to require a lot of support. So often, our hopes are high and then they're dashed. I mean, it's been pretty stunning, really, to see 20 years of democracy in Mali just flip. Mali, in the south at least, was a relatively stable country and beginning to get some traction on basic development goals, and it's suddenly all thrown up in the air. It's very, very disconcerting indeed. So, I think it is important to keep a watchful eye out for and to support people who are doing the hard yards in emerging democracies, countries in transition, and see how they can be supported and how their voices can get a hearing beyond the shores of their own countries.
Thank you. Kathy, and then the next question's down here.
Thanks, Kate. Kathy Owens from Daring Consulting, a political consultancy led by women. I'm at the Boundary Commission. The changed boundaries that we're going to have in Wales for the parliamentary seats are going to have a disproportionate effect on women. So we may only have 2 Welsh women returned as MPs at the next election. We're having quite a lot of difficulty getting special measures again here in Wales. So I was wondering whether you had any tips from around the world on how to get women selected in open seats, because clearly there's an issue with soft support networks for men, but also it often comes down to Churchillian speeches at a hustings, a one-off event, and women will tend to lose out. So I just wondered if you had any tips for getting more women selected to stand.
Well, as I said, the all-woman shortlist definitely has an effect, and that's a measure parties can take of their own accord, and I hope there's nothing in the law which stands in the way of it in the United Kingdom. The other thing, looking at it from someone who was involved in political party for a pretty solid 40 years at home, 40 years plus actually, I mean, women have to join parties and be active in them. In the end, political parties are making the decisions about who runs. And so while, having a strong movement outside the parties for women's representation, and we had one going back to the 70s called Women's Electoral Lobby, in the end, the decisions are going to be made in the party mechanisms. And so I do think, women have to get in there to make their voices felt, at least at the selection time. So if I were, woman in political party in Wales and looking at this situation, I'd be saying, well, how can I be a part of changing that? And I think it would be about making sure that women and others who are sympathetic to this cause are joined up, become members in time, to participate in selection procedures, and also be using the mechanisms of the parties to look at constitutions and rules and what the strategy is through the next election, try and get the party to set targets for representation. So in other words, I'm saying the mechanisms of the party itself are extremely important, and that's why we've produced the book for the political parties, which I'm very happy to make available. In fact, you can download it from our website. It'll be there on a PDF. We launched it during the Commission on the Status of Women in New York, just at the very beginning of March, and it does have examples of what political parties have done to make a breakthrough in this area.
I think this is quite a live debate, whether it's in terms of political selection or appointment to public office, the amount of effort you put into empowering women and building their skills and involving them, and the amount that has to come from the other side, as it were, whether that's quotas, or I was very interested in your PR idea that when people see a long list. So it's a balance of making sure women are participating and that the organisation is receptive.
In fact, sitting in the front row is one of my former colleagues from New Zealand, Darren Hughes, who's now advocacy officer with the Electoral Reform Society. And Darren, one of your key issues would be, obviously it's proportional representation, but has the society also looked at it here from the point of view of women's representation?
The big campaign that we've done, Counting Women, which is the Electoral Reform Society, is part of to boost the number of women at all levels of participation in democracy, and one of our particular goals is to hold the Prime Minister to his statement before the election that 1/3 of the cabinet posts or ministerial posts will be held by women. So we're taking action on things right away, and also the longer term issues, boosting participation and membership.
Thank you. Could we have the mic at the front? You've been very, very patient. Sorry, we were on a bit of a roll there. Right at the
red
front
jacket here. Yeah.
Thank you. Good evening, Neelam Bharadwaj. I want to really focus a bit on your international role. And we've been talking about women's voice and representation. I want to go back quite a little bit further back. And when we look at countries and regimes backed by Western governments, and pick up the example of President Karzai in Afghanistan or Swatwali in Pakistan, where Taliban have managed to have their way about girls not going to school or schools being shut, and thus depriving women even the basic opportunities of education. And yet we know that often it's the education that gets women out of poverty or out to have their voices heard. So what role is United Nations playing in places like that to ensure, firstly, those sort of things don't happen? Or what are the kind of sanctions to stop that happening?
Don't have any sanctions, but you know, the UN has campaigned relentlessly for the Millennium Development Goals, and one of the key areas of those goals, one of the specific targets, of course, is universal enrolment in primary education by 2015, and universal means every boy and every girl, and also a specific goal also on gender parity in secondary education. So we relentlessly advocate for this. Now, we are within reach of every child being enrolled in school. Not there yet, and we need, there needs to be some more progress in a range of countries to achieve that. I think we've still got 67 million children who've never had the chance to go to school in our world. And also troubling is, it's one thing to get a child into school, it's another for them to be able to stay through for all sorts of reasons. So work to do there. I know the circumstances in Afghanistan are quite difficult for the reasons which you mentioned. The work done by Greg Mortensen on schools for girls is, I guess, he's become a little bit controversial with some of the things written, but he set up that institute, and others have done the same, to put in place schools in rural areas in Afghanistan and the mountainous areas of Pakistan, where basic rule was community school, but the girls have got to be able to go. And from what I recall, the experience in areas where Taliban-affiliated groups were prominent was that if the school was genuinely seen as an initiative of the local community, the school tended to survive with the girls in it. If they saw it as something that was imposed from outside, as it were, it didn't get the traction. And indeed, the school might have even been burnt down. There's been examples of that. But if the local leadership came in behind the school, said, this is what we want for our children, boys and girls, it tended to make it through, which might tell us something about the importance of working with the grassroots and with communities for them to express their aspirations and be very much the guiding and leading force in what's happening in development in their communities.
Thank you. I'm Norma Jarbo, and I'm very interested what your experiences would have been in terms of leadership of some of the not-for-profit third sector kind of aid agencies, not specifically the NGOs, but more in the not-for-profit sector. We see a number of women who lead those. We see a number of men who lead them as well. I'm wondering if you see the difference in what they achieve or how they go about it, depending on what gender their leadership is. Mm.
Well, it's always hard to generalise, and I won't even generalise as specifically as sort of organisations in that category which are women-headed. But it seems to me that women are likely to bring a more practical focus on what will make a difference to the life of the community. And that's why it's been interesting to me to look at this evidence coming through from India on the women-led councils and what they prioritised. Basic things like water. They didn't particularly want to preside over the ribbon cutting of the new road. No, they wanted the water for the village. And there's plenty of other sort of parallels one could give. So I think that whatever our society, women disproportionately are ending up with the responsibility for the care of family, including extended family. So they tend to be very focused on what will make a difference to people at the basic level. It's water, it's energy, it's the local school, it's the health service. These are the things that really count. That's what seems to be coming through in the research about the impact women are having.
Thank you. There, and then Marilyn.
My name is Max. I'm an advocate. Thank you for that answer to that question, because that's been helping me to ask what I want to ask. One of the things that you can do to help the cause is to have a great International Women's Day. And we had a tremendous International Women's Day here in Wales. But one of the central issues about it was the conflict between the women that were speaking as to whether the most important thing was structural or whether it was to do with a personal way of living. Now, you have just answered a question very much on the personal side, dealing with India, women, how they respond to problems differently, because obviously equality is not the same as sameness. Men and women are not the same. We want equality, but it's not sameness. And I think you've given a wonderful answer to that last question. May I ask you, if I may, in terms of leadership, which is obviously what is the aspiration, what do you think, you may say doing the hard yards, because I can tell you're a New Zealander, because that's a New Zealand phrase, to do the hard yards. May I ask you, if I may, what do you think are the 3 outstanding things that make a good leader?
3 outstanding things. Firstly, I think you have to be able to communicate a clear vision as to where you wish to take the country or the province or the organisation which you aspire to lead. So you have to communicate that this is not actually about you just wanting to sit in the top seat. You want this position because you believe that this could be the way your country or whatever could be. Secondly, you have to demonstrate that you have a plan for achieving that, which means you have to be very, very task-focused. You have a plan and it's practical, and you need to be clear that you can't get from where you are to where you'd like to see your country or whatever be in one step. It's going to be a series of steps. That's why the plan is important. And thirdly, you have to have and be able to communicate that you have an enormous amount of energy, because any leadership position requires energy that's going to back the vision. It can't just be words, it's got to be that you personally are going to invest every ounce of your energy into making these happen. So the vision, the plan and the energy, I think, are the top things.
That sounds like it. Sounds like a fabulous...
I'm Kemeny, I'm part of Women Making a Difference. I just wanted to say that to counter arguments about quotas in this country at least, is without quotas we've ended up with a largely male, largely white government who are not only those things are much the same age, they went to the same school. Now, if that's not special measures, I don't know what is.
Thank you. We'll take that as rhetorical, I think.
Jenny Sims, Wales Hi, Jenny Sims, Wales rep for the National Union of Journalists. Have you got some practical advice and tips for bringing in younger people to enter politics? What can be done to give them more confidence and enthusiasm taking this path?
I think the potential for exciting young people is actually quite great, because through the new social media, there's ways of reaching out to and engaging young people that we never had before. I mean, it used to be really hard yards. Where are young people? Well, they are in cyberspace, right? So, and I think political parties which get with it and really use these mechanisms to encourage debate and engagement and participation should really get onto a roll. I mean, I'm very interested in social media, and I do run my own Twitter and Facebook pages, by the way. Helen Clark UNDP Twitter. And there is a Helen Clark Facebook page which is open. But the feedback is incredible, and good feedback, not sort of sycophantic feedback or, sort of stupidly unconstructive feedback. People really wanting to know, wanting to engage. From time to time, I do a global Twitter chat where you say, promote it for a week or two beforehand that I'll be online to, sort of interact on a particular issue. And we've had fantastic input. And it's overwhelmingly from young people. We've done it on International Women's Day, we've done it around the Arab states uprisings and transitions, done it on sustainable development, etc., etc. So I've no doubt that young people are interested in the issues. They want to know how they can get their voice heard. They want to be heard. And I think then it's up to political parties to strategise on how they can be inclusive of this and not make politics seem just like, something for those of us in our late middle age, but something that really is quite exciting. I mean, the Occupy movements have had no trouble getting the young because they've had a sense of energy about them. So I think political parties have to wake up, smell the coffee, get a sense of energy and excitement, and debate real issues, and be clear that it's not just cosmetics. They do want young people's voices. They want to include and engage.
Well, we're fortunate that we have Rita here, not stuck in cyberspace. We've got the mic somewhere?
Yes.
Oh.
Thank you, Rita Singh. My background is predominantly in the private sector, so there's some interesting correlations between women in public life and women on boards, one of the issues that have been highlighted by our leader. Although we have a target of getting women on boards, faltering, although he didn't quite reach the 50% target and only left it at 25 or 30% of getting women on boards, there are some interesting correlations between how difficult it is to get women in public life to lead a role. In private sector, where you see many women to be middle managers but never quite reaching the top. There are examples within schools where you have a number of teachers who are female but never quite becoming head teachers. There is, I mean, it comes back to your point, Kate, about empowering women. It's one thing getting them into the politics. Do you think there is something about a sustained program of work to get the women who are then entering into their field to actually make them confident enough and capable enough to reach the top? At the moment, I think that may be a missing step, in that once you get there, there isn't something there that keeps you going and sustaining that effort to make you reach that leading top position.
Yes, I think there's a tremendous amount that can be done in this area professionally, for example. And I'd really encourage, the organisations that, are professional organisations of whether we're talking legal profession, accountants, teaching, whatever, to be thinking about how they could actually sustain the aspirations of women who tend to be stuck in the lower and middle ranks. I remember last year when I was home in New Zealand in August, I addressed quite a packed lecture theatre at one of the universities where a group, Women in Tertiary Education, bring women in tertiary education together from across the country. And they're really looking at these kinds of steps, what's holding us back, what are the strategies, and it's great peer support as well. So I'm very much in favour of those sort of moves. I think they can be done by the universities, by professional associations, whatever. Something I think you said earlier also triggered me to make a comment about women going onto public boards, committees, etc. When I was Prime Minister, one of our cabinet committees was the Committee on Honours and Appointments. And I'm sure that in the United Kingdom as well, there must be some mechanism for making these appointments. New Zealand has a tremendous number of statutory appointments to state-owned companies, boards of all kinds, committees and so on. And we would get proposals up. We would always look at the gender representation. We did have a women's appointment file, which was administered by our Women's Affairs Ministry, and women could register on that file, so that was always something to draw on. I did have occasions where ministers would come with suggestions for appointment, which would have meant that boards had no women, and we would send them away and say, look harder. And they used to say, oh, but you can't find the woman. You say, you'll find them. You'll come back with women. So, again, these are mechanisms to be used in countries. What is the system for appointment? Who's keeping an eye out for the woman? Who's vetting this? Nothing, by the way, like the breath of fresh air through media on these things. To be keeping a running watch of how many women are being appointed. What's the proportion of women on statutory boards and committees and so on.
Thank you. We're coming very much towards the end of our time now, so it's a kind of a last call. Got one person over. Oh, people always put their hands up, and it's the very, very last time. I'm not sure, Rosemary or Jane, if you wanted to contribute. Okay, we've got one person over here, and who? Okay, three more people.
Hi, my name's Lynette Jones, and I work for Oxfam Company. Just want to tap into kind of both of your expertise with the UNDP now, and also your position, obviously, as Prime Minister before. Considering the economic crisis around the world and the fact that many countries are reneging on their aid commitments, how do you see that having an effect on development in the next few years and potentially over the next few decades, and on what that might mean for women in particular?
Yeah, I mean, it is quite dire. The OECD has just issued a latest update on what's happened with official development assistance, and it's dropped. You know, for the first time really in years, it's dropped absolutely. I mean, Britain is one of the very few countries which has got an upward trajectory. Australia is another, and Denmark has recently increased as well, and Korea. But no one else in the OECD really is going up. New Zealand perhaps a little bit off a very, very low base, I should say. And some are absolutely cutting. You know, I think the Spanish budget for ODA is down 75%. I mean, it's huge. Virtually been obliterated in Italy. Ireland took a huge cut. The French spend is down, etc., etc. So what are the consequences of this? You know, I really feel that a lot of countries are on the verge of a breakthrough with some catalytic support, and ODA needs to be catalytic because it is but a small proportion of the total amount of resource which is available for development. But you know, smart, catalytic, well-applied ODA can be incredibly important. But at the very time when, you know, even McKinsey's is issuing reports saying it's Africa's moment and so on, the aid is tapering off, and this is really a great concern. So, you know, full marks to Oxfam and the others, led by a woman, I might say, in the United Kingdom, Dame Barbara Stocking. You know, full marks for the advocacy that you're doing on this, because you know, if those of us who come from, you know, Western societies which are ageing, where we're not actually, you know, generating large new markets for goods, products and services ourselves, it's not only that, you know, developing countries being able to develop is a good thing in its own self, it actually might be our salvation as well, because we are also looking for markets and, you know, and we're also looking for the peace and security which comes with development. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why it is good for people in developing countries to be supporting development, apart from the strong moral and philanthropic case for it. So please, Oxfam, I know you'll keep your voice very loud and clear on this. Thank you.
Kia ora, Helen.
Kia ora.
I was just wondering, do you think the IOC should make a stand against countries that admit men-only teams to the Olympics? And in addition to that, what can we do to counter religious-based arguments to exclude women?
Religious-based?
Arguments.
Armies.
Arguments.
Arguments. Well, you know, my observation would be that when religion's invoked, it's usually a misuse of the religion's basic philosophy, and I believe that quite strongly. I don't know, no major religion in its basic tenets has built into its belief system that men and women aren't equal, but it's a perversion of it to then sort of extrapolate something that's the opposite of that. The IOC, well, that'd be a bold move, wouldn't it? Again, you know, be a good cause for national Olympic committees to take up, but to see whether the IOC would make a stand on this and say that as a matter of principle, we would expect every national team to be, you know, entering, you know, in sports across the range. Well, this is so, and you know, being a New Zealander and having come from years of involvement in the movement against apartheid in sport, and being told by our rugby union at the time that politics and sport was separate, I don't buy a bar of it.
Our very last question there, if you don't mind, last but not least.
Hi, it's a question relating to the role of the media. The media is probably the way in which most female politicians are presented to the world. And we had slogans in the last American presidential election between Democrats with things against Hillary Clinton saying she can't please her husband, how could she please America? And other female politicians referred to as the Iron Lady and the Bulldog. And it's not particularly positive representations of women in the media as political figures. And I was wondering how you think the media can support women in politics more.
I could write a book about this. Because there is a lot of stereotyping. And again, maybe it's something that journalists as a profession might like to take up, sensitization about women, reporting of women in public life, and having a good hard look at whether a different lens is being applied to women as against men. I mean, women who are strong are often portrayed as tough. Strength is good in a man, toughness is often in a woman, and there has, I've observed over the years, been a tendency to report on what women wear and how they look, which you don't get applied in the same way to men. So I think, again, it's a question of awareness, advocacy, sensitising, so that people think twice about what they write, to be fair. It's not something you can legislate for or regulate for. It's really a cultural and attitudinal change to the role of women that needs to happen.
Well, thank you very much. I need to draw this to a conclusion. I'd like to thank Rosemary once again for organising this for us, but primarily, Helen, to thank you for your fabulous presentation, this amazingly wide range of subjects that you've not faltered with a really interesting and stimulating answer to. And I'm sure that everybody in the audience, like me, will have at least one new idea, one concrete thing we're going to do as a result of this. So I'm sure everybody would like to join me in thanking you very, very much indeed. Thank you.